No one, I kept waiting for somebody to come up and be like, here, do this or you're not cool. That never happens. What happens is who you hang out with informs the pressure you feel to engage in a certain behavior, right? So if I was hanging out with all people that like playing flag football, eventually I'd play flag football. If I hang out with people that are vaping, eventually I'm going to vape. And so what I did was I changed the people I hung out with. And so the people I hung out with weren't doing these things. So then I didn't feel the pressure to do them myself.
Hi, I'm Sophia Manavi. I'm a peer counselor, and thank you for joining us here. Can you both introduce yourselves and share a little bit about your careers?
Sure. Hi, Sophia. I'm Josh Fingerhut. I'm a therapist in Los Angeles. I work with Doug Rosen here. I came into therapy after struggling for about 15 years with addiction. Went to a treatment center, got sober, became a therapist, and now use my history with substances to help inform how I work with teenagers, as well as incorporating boxing and other movement into my therapy, because sometimes talking isn't enough. Sometimes you gotta like hit something.
My name is Doug Rosen. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also am an alumni of Beverly Hills High School.
And can you guys share what inspired you to go into the work of addiction and recovery?
Yeah, well, I think I'll speak for myself. I had a first-hand knowledge of what it was like to be addicted, and things got really bad, like to the point where I was 10 hours away from dying. And, you know, by age 35, I had burned everything to the ground. And so it was a question of like, do I want to live or die? And, you know, a voice inside of me was like, you know, why don't we try to live and like live well? And so that was 6 years ago. And in my journey in recovery, I met Doug. And he's been a wonderful, massive influence on how I want to live my life. Yeah.
You know, I like I said earlier, I'm an alumni of Beverly Hills High School, and I started smoking weed when I was a senior in high school here. And my life really derailed. And I thought it was harmless. I thought it was a plant. I thought it was natural. I thought it, you know, didn't matter and I would grow out of it, and I didn't. And 10 years later, I had to end up in treatment. And I really wanted to help people, especially young teenagers, that were going through what I went through. You know, I had a pretty good childhood, but then my parents got divorced, and that messed me up. And, you know, I had a little brother that annoyed me, you know, and stuff like that. That's just normal stuff that, you know, I didn't really learn healthy ways of coping with. And I really wanted to give back and help people in a way that I feel would have helped me.
And what motivated you guys to seek help when you were in that spot?
What motivated me to seek help was the Los Angeles Police Department arresting me and saying that you are either going to go to jail or you're going to go to rehab. And I'm a 5'9" white Jew from Beverly Hills. Like, jail was not going to happen. I wasn't going to do well there. So I was like, I'll go to rehab. And I went to this place called Beit Teshuva, which is in Los Angeles, in Culver City area. And I went there with the intentions of actually not changing. But I stayed long enough to where I wanted to change. And they were piloting a program going to schools and speaking to kids at the time. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to go and tell kids the story. Because when I was at Beverly, I had a police officer come. I don't know if they still do that. But Beverly Hills Police Department came and was like, this is what 5.5 grams of marijuana looks like. And I was like, whatever, right? This is not important. I wanted to talk from a real human standpoint and tell kids what really was going on, my real struggles with, you know, self-medicating my anxiety and depression and fitting in. Even though it was popular and I played sports here, I still struggled with fitting in, right? And that was inside of me, and I didn't realize that I was self-medicating with marijuana and other substances down the line. So that's what motivates me today and every day and in the past.
I got this little tiny scar right here. I don't know if you guys can see it. that I got from a dirty needle when I used syringes when I was getting high. So very long story short, I got a flesh-eating bacteria that was spreading to my heart. I had 10 hours left to live. I went to Cedars-Sinai. I told them I had a spider bite because I didn't want to tell them and they were like, "Do you do drugs?" And I was like, "A little bit." And they're like, "You're going to be here for a while." I thought they were going to give me a shot of antibiotics, but I went into surgery. 3 days later, I woke up and there was just a hole in my arm, and all of my family had showed up and my best friends had showed up, and they were had that look, and it was just there was no more hiding. And there was this question of what happens next? And sure enough, my parents had heard of Beit Shuvah, and they called the head rabbi, and he came to the hospital room, and he cursed me out, which was the best thing in the world to be called out in that way. And then he told me about his treatment center, and I was like, all right. I had literally had nowhere else to go. I had nothing else to do. But kind of like Doug, I was like, I'll be sober for a month, right? I'll give it a month, right? And then a month came, I was like, I'll give it 2. Right, and then I've been kind of playing that game, and I'm almost at 6 years now. So it's a fun game to play where it's I'll keep pushing, right? I think I've promised myself 10 years now. When I get to 10 years, I'll probably make it 15, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah. And during your recovery process, how did you manage temptation and peer pressure from other people and your past friends, maybe, or something?
Shoo. There's a lot of joy and celebration in the recovery world, and there's also a lot of tragedy, and there's a lot of death. And within my first week of being in treatment, a very nice girl who was a nurse and had told me about my arm, and she was, well educated about what my skin graft and scar was about. She died from a fentanyl overdose. And it was oh, right, we're kind of in a bit of a war zone. And so for me, it was understanding the stakes of really what's at play, of if you relapse, there's a high likelihood you will either die immediately if you are using opiates, or I was using meth. You just derail your life to the point where you have no money left. People don't trust you anymore, and it's not really a life worth living, and I would have ended up underneath a bridge. So understanding of what's at stake for me really got me plugged into oh, I want to fight for my life. The biggest thing was going from a place of thinking I had no value and that I didn't matter, and beginning to cultivate that sense of no, I think I actually do have something to say. My voice does matter. And then you meet cool people along the way, like this guy.
I think peer pressure is an interesting concept, right? And so how I battled it was I hung out with different peers. Peer pressure is just who you hang out with. I kept waiting for somebody to come up and be like, here, do this or you're not cool. That never happens. What happens is who you hang out with informs the pressure you feel to engage in a certain behavior. Right? So if I was hanging out with all people that like playing flag football, eventually I'd play flag football. If I hang out with people that are vaping, eventually I'm going to vape. And so what I did was I changed the people I hung out with. And so the people I hung out with weren't doing these things. So then I didn't feel the pressure to do them myself. And, like we talked about, the advertising industry is based on peer pressure. Let me convince you to buy something or do something that you might or might not need. That is my goal, right? And so if I do that, that's peer pressure. So I changed the peers that I was surrounding myself with, and that really helped.
It really shows how important good friends are and people that support you.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really tough because teenagers are supposed to experiment and they're supposed to try things and they're supposed to, and not just drugs and alcohol, but many sorts of things and different behaviors and different outfits and different likes, and try this class and that class. And it really does inform who you become, right? The people you hang out with really do inform what you feel like doing subconsciously, right? There's a reason why half of the boys have the same haircut nowadays, right? They all go to the same barber, or everyone's wearing white Air Force Ones, right? No one's saying do it. It's just that you want to assimilate and fit in, which is really a human characteristic. The biggest concern with the drug culture today is there's been a huge shift in experimentation. You know, when people experimented in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, the only people that would ever die from a drug overdose were intravenous needle heroin users. Those are the people that died. With today's world and with fentanyl and with lacing of drugs, we now live in a world where instant death is part of experimentation. And that is the biggest fear that I have for my kids, for you guys, is that casual experimentation comes with the risk of addiction, just like it always did. But it now comes with the risk of instant death, because you have to assume that everything is laced. And it's an unfortunate consequence, but it's the world that you guys are growing up in.
One other thing too, I'll just add to it, like, a little bit more kind of like philosophically about addiction, is that the pursuit of pleasure often leads to pain, right? People do drugs and they try to escape, and they numb out with whether it's video games and TikTok, right, or substances. But then there's that moment when the substance wears off or the phone goes down, and then that pain, it didn't like go away, it just got subdued. And then it comes back even harder. And so then you need more of that thing that you were just using to suppress it again. And so that's my concern, that people don't understand that, like, when they're numbing out, they're not getting rid of that pain or that depression or anxiety. They're pushing it down, and it's going to spring up again at a later date.
How would you describe the current culture surrounding vaping, and how do you believe it impacts teenagers?
Why don't you start?
I think the current culture around vaping is really one that's driven by money, and what we saw in the early 2000s and in 2010s is that cigarette smoking was on the decline. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of money lost for tobacco companies, and so they've invested heavily, tobacco companies, in vaping, because they see that the young people are gravitating towards vaping, and it's really a money thing. It's all about money. And if I could get young people in high school hooked on a behavior, I get the most valuable thing, which is a customer for life. Mm-hmm. So the goal, right, is to get young people hooked. They're not trying to get 50-year-olds hooked on vaping. They're trying to get young people hooked, and what they've done is they've created it's gone viral amongst teenagers, and they've branded it that it's going to be less harmful than cigarettes.
Right.
Maybe not, right? We'll know in 30 or 40 years what the consequences of regular vaping are. But we know that inhaling anything into your lungs isn't good, so it probably is not going to end well for those that choose to engage in vaping. We just don't know how bad.
Yeah, and also, like, if you can't pronounce the names of the chemicals that you're putting in your body, like, maybe think once or twice about that, right? Yeah. And I think, too, like, just talking about more of, like, psychologically with vaping, people think that, like, oh, I can stop whenever I want to, it's not that big of a deal, and it's like, nicotine addiction is really subtle. And you're unaware of, like, how strong it is until you actually try to stop. And I usually liken people's vapes to, you know, if you ever had like a blankie or a little stuffed animal when you were like a toddler, you felt really safe. But the moment that got taken away, you were like freaking out, right? Like, I need my safety back. It's the same thing with the vape, right? And so people assign all of this safety and it's going to calm me down. And that is all a lie. Within 72 hours, nicotine is completely out of your system. So after that, it's all psychological.
That's a really good way to put it, with the blanket and the stuffed animal.
Yeah.
I think that helps even younger kids sometimes understand it a little bit more too.
Well, and there's also like a good analogy, metaphor, I forget, you know, one of those things, imagery, is there's a plant called the pitcher plant, where it's like a tube-shaped plant that attracts flies. and has like sweet nectar at the rim of it, and flies come down there and they're eating the nectar. This is great. I can like fly off whenever I want to, and I can go eat my nectar, but then like the nectar gets a little sweeter further in, further and further in. The further in the fly goes, then all of a sudden it can't fly out again, and then it gets digested and eaten by the plant. It's the same thing with nicotine. People start picking it up like, oh, I can like take it and leave it. It's no big deal. And then, 2 weeks into it, you're like, oh, I don't know if I can put this down.
What misconceptions about vaping do you think are prevalent?
I mean, I think the biggest misconception is that it's not dangerous.
Yeah.
It's not going to be harmful. It's less harmful than cigarettes. I think that's the basis of the marketing and what has gotten young people hooked on it is that myth, right? And I don't think that that's going to end up being true. We already know some consequences of vaping, right? Where you see people with popcorn lungs at a young age and stuff like that. But the long-term effects, it hasn't been around long enough to find out. So the misconception is that this is not going to be harmful, or it's less harmful than cigarettes. Like I said earlier, we'll know in 40 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, just this whole thing of feeling cool, right? Like, oh, I'm this, independent person. I choose to vape, and like it's part of my identity. When in reality, all you're doing is playing into corporate hands of like control.
Yeah.
And there isn't a lot of like non-conformity when you are vaping. Like you're addicted to nicotine. And not to mention when we talk about like, vaping is quote healthier than smoke and tar from a cigarette. What you're forgetting is the amount of nicotine that you get with a single hit in a vape is way more powerful than you would get from a cigarette. And so the concentration of nicotine is hitting the brain way stronger, way faster than cigarettes ever could. You can't smoke in your bed, right? You couldn't like smoke indoors. Now you can vape anywhere, right? And so like the frequency and intensity of it is increasing while people are being told like it's not that bad.
I would say this too, just to talk about nicotine. Nicotine by itself is not the worst thing in the world, right? Nicotine is not what causes the problems associated with cigarette smoking. It's the process when you take something from a solid or a liquid and turn it into a gas. That burning, that heating up, that chemical process, and inhaling that into your lungs is what's harmful. So if we were to inhale, if we were to sit indoors and inhale wood burning all day long, that would cause serious damage over time. It's the burning of something that is bad. Nicotine is what gets you hooked and gets you to repeat inhaling something burning. But the nicotine by itself is not the worst thing in the world. It's the inhalation of the chemicals. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I like what you said about the non-conformity of vaping. It's not just affecting one person. It's people of all shapes and sizes and colors. It's not just a certain crowd.
Yeah.
Vaping targets everyone.
Yeah. Well, and then also just too, like, I think there's also the stories that people assign to vaping. Like, I used to vape, right? Like, and I put a lot of, identity-based stuff into my vape. Like, I thought it was cool for a while, and then like when I was quitting, the fear of like, oh gosh, I don't know if I'll be able to handle that, and then my anxiety like jacked up, right? And so that intersection of psychological and also biochemical and the relationship to nicotine and all that, like it gets hard to kind of untether all that, untangle all that.
For our next question, if a teenager or a friend is concerned about their addiction to nicotine or e-cigarettes, how can they support or help them?
So as a former addict, I was addicted to a lot of things. Being told to stop wasn't really the thing that worked for me. but being shown just by being around other people who weren't addicted, that there were other ways of being, had way more lasting effects on my decision to remove all substances from my behavior.
Right. So like that concept of a natural high versus.
Yeah, or just like, look, like if you're hanging out with your friend and like this one friend is like decided not to vape, but they're still able to hang out and have a good time and through their actions show the vaping friend that like, I don't need that to hang out, to have fun or whatever, that it might, the message might not be interpreted right away, but over time, right? Like that kind of understanding of like, oh, I don't need to do this in order to fit in.
So what advice would you offer someone who is currently struggling with addiction themselves?
You know, if there was somebody that was struggling with substance use, meaning, you know, drugs, narcotics, right? I would really encourage them to reach out to a trusted advisor, parent, friend, uncle, counselor, staff member at school, teacher for help, because that's, you know, that can be life and death, especially in the world where fentanyl exists and stuff like that. In the world of vaping, right, if they're struggling, you know, they're going to have to find other things to occupy their time so they're not doing it. And they're going to, like Josh said, have to hang out with different people, right? If you have 10 friends and 10 friends are vaping, you're probably going to vape. If you have 10 friends and none of them are vaping, eventually, right, you will stop doing the behavior because you want to assimilate and get along with. Yeah. But I think that when you talk about substance use, it's a little different because that's life and death in today's world.
It really comes down to the people around you, especially trusted adults or individuals in your life.
Correct. Reaching out for help, right? Reaching out for help and accepting the help is what helps move the needle forward a little bit.
I would also say, we have a saying in the recovery world, like if you hang out at the barber shop long enough, you're going to get a haircut. Meaning if you're trying to quit vaping and all your friends are vaping, like your odds are not good, right? I would also remind people that while nicotine itself is a highly addictive drug, it leaves the body very quickly. So within, I think around 10 hours, 90% of the nicotine from your last vape will have left your system, and within 72 hours, it will be completely gone. So that's 3 days. If you stop vaping, nicotine will be out of your system, and then it's all psychological from there.
Right.
And then it's the question of like, well, what do you really want, right? Like, as Doug said, like you got to replace it with something. So I would ask the person, what do you want to do, right? Like what's the person you want to become? And if this person, you know, wants to be a vapor, like, okay, hard to argue with that. But if they have bigger dreams for themselves of like, oh, I want to be more active and I want to be, you know, an artist and I want to get better at this craft, right? It's like, cool. Well, then how is nicotine affecting that, right? If you're spending your time, your money, and your health on something that is poisoning you versus like mastering a craft or getting better at sports or whatever, right? Like you have to decide how you want to be in this world.
Right.
But one vaping requires no effort, right? Mastering a craft requires effort. And so that's why people tend to do the easier thing to stimulate themselves.
Right. So like, for example, I like drawing or painting. That takes, you know, quite a while to master. And it takes effort, it takes money, but if you're vaping constantly, or if you have an addiction to vaping, you know, that's taking money out of your pocket from something that you could be, you know, trying to do that could lead to a life that's not only addiction free, but is also like something that you enjoy.
Yeah,
that's right.
And not to mention too, like there's so people think that like when they vape, they are calming themselves down. So a little bit of truth to that because the body has become addicted to the behavior and to nicotine. But what happens is as soon as you blow out that vape, your body enters into a low level anxious state because it's like going through withdrawals. So it's kind of hard to like really focus on a craft or a sport or whatever when you're having this added layer of stress and anxiety. Like being a teenager in 2023 is hard enough without any other things. And so now you're like giving yourself this like just added layer of constant stress of like, when's my next vape? When's my next vape? Right? And it's going to be distracting for studying, mastering a craft, you know, just showing up for your own life.
For our last question, is there anything else you want our listeners to know?
Oh, so much, you know, right? Like, don't, you know, it's like Josh was saying, it's really hard being a kid. And it always has been, but it's really hard in 2023 to be a teenager and navigate the world. And when you look at what you're up against, right, in a lot of ways you're up against, you know, big business. Because everything is about money, right? So why did Facebook buy Instagram, right? You want me to tell you why? Because when you ask a group of teenagers how many of you have a Facebook account, none of them raise their hands. When you ask them how many of you have an Instagram account, they all raise their hands. And so what they saw, and what are the odds that you'll have Instagram for the rest of your life, right? Very likely that'll be a primary social media platform. So they got you hooked on their behavior. Facebook saw that and they bought it for $1 billion, right? And like all these things are, you know, about getting you hooked on a behavior, whether it be Instagram or Snapchat and their streaks, or vaping or alcohol, right? Like alcohol is normalized in our culture. I think in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to realize that alcohol on any level is as bad as smoking a cigarette. It systemically, over time, destroys the body. Look at our culture with marijuana, right? And how that's become, you know, incredibly pervasive all through Los Angeles and America. And what we've done is we legalized the drug from 1970, right? Old weed that had 3% THC. Mm-hmm. And now we're talking about this new weed with 30 to 90% THC. But it's the same drug. And it has the same effects. And it's all about, at the end of the day, it all comes down to money and getting you guys, right? They're going after teenagers because, one, parents spend most of their money on teenagers. And two, teenagers are the next generation of earners in America. So if I get them hooked on a behavior now, I get the most valuable thing for my business, which is a customer for life. And my hope is that you guys, and in us talking to you and what we work on with people, is that you won't get sucked into that culture, that you'll rise above it and say, I'm not going to let this happen to me. I am not going to become what they want me to become, right? Go to work, you know, vape during the day, at the end of the day, smoke some weed, right? Like, just spend my money on stuff. And social media too, right? Like, the most valuable thing we have on this planet at our disposal is time. And when you look at how much time people of all ages spend on TikTok and Instagram, right? We are giving these companies money because they're advertising to us. And what do we get in return? Anxiety and depression and FOMO, right? Like, it's literally a trade-off. They're monetizing our mental health.
Yeah, I think I heard a thing about like some of the Silicon Valley CEOs who like run these companies don't let their kids like get on these apps, right? So like, why is that, right? There, just to echo what Doug was saying, like, if I was a teenager now, the message that I would want to hear is just to like think for yourself. And it's hard because there's so much subtle advertising hitting you all the time. But the most valuable age for any company to get a hold of is a 17-year-old, right? Like, you are about to become a legal adult, right? You have your parents' money. You're going to start becoming an earner yourself, right? Like, that is the target. And so you are against a lot of forces. And so I would ask the question, like, try to blot that all out. Like, let's just pretend for a second that social media and this world didn't exist and like we're just in a little bubble, and be like, what do you want? What's going to make you happy? And start to get in touch with that voice instead of being told what's going to make you happy.
We would like to thank our generous sponsors and partners, Michael J. LeBeau, Norman Aid peer counselors, KBEV, and of course, we'd like to thank our listeners. Stay safe and make today well lived.